I'm now reading the book on Grand Strategy by John Lewis Gaddis. Chapter 1, Crossing the Hellespont. The date is 480 BCE. The place is Abydos, the town on the Asian side of the Hellespont, where it narrows to just over a mile in width. The scene is worthy of Hollywood in its heyday. Xerxes, Persia's king of kings, ascends a throne on a promontory from which he can see armies assembled. The historian Herodotus tells us over 1.5 million. Had the number been only a tenth of that, as is more likely, it would still have approximated the size of Eisenhower's forces on D-Day in 1944. The Hellespont has no bridge now, but Xerxes had two then. One rested on 360 boats lashed together, the other on 314. Both curved to accommodate winds and currents. For after an earlier bridge had broken apart in a storm, the furious king beheaded the builders and ordered the waters themselves whipped and branded. Somewhere on the bottom there presumably lie to this day the iron fighters he had thrown in for good measure. On that day, though, the waters are calm and Xerxes is content, until he burst into tears. His advisor and uncle Artabanus asked why. He said, quote, "Here are all these thousands, and not one of them will be alive 100 years from now." End quote. Artabanus consults his master by reminding him of all the calamities that can make life intolerable and death a relief. Xerxes acknowledges this, but demands, "Tell me the very truth. Would Artabanus have favored the task at hand, a second Persian invasion of Greece in just over a decade? Had they not both had the same frightening dream? Now it is Artabanus who shudders. Quote, "I'm still full, nay overfull of fear." End quote. Xerxes' dream had come twice after Artabanus dissuaded him from avenging the Greeks' humiliation of Darius, Xerxes' father, at a marathon 10 years earlier. As if in anticipation of Hamlet, still 2 millennia into the future, apparition, regal in aspect, paternal in attitude, had issued an ultimatum, quote, "If you do not launch your war at once, just as a short while raised you to be great and mighty, so with speed again shall you be humble." End quote. Artabanus at the first scoffed at the dream's significance, whereupon Xerxes made him trade clothes and sleep in the royal bed. The spectre reappeared, so terrifying Artabanus that he woke up screaming, instantly urging the new invasion. Xerxes then gave the orders. The great force gathered at Sardis, sacrificed 1,000 heifers at the ruins of Troy, arrived at the Hellespont, found the bridges ready, and was preparing to cross them when the king allowed his uncle one last chance to voice whatever reservations he might yet have. Artabanus, despite his nightmare, can't resist. The enemies ahead, he warns, will not just be Greeks, formidable fighters though they are. They will also include the land and the sea. The march around the Aegean will traverse territories incapable of feeding so large an army. There won't be enough harbors to shelter ships if storms arise. Exhaustion, even starvation, could set in before fighting a single battle. The prudent leader dwells and reflects on everything that can happen to him, but is bold when he is in the thick of action. Xerxes listens patiently, but objects that if you were to take account of everything, you would never do anything. It's better to have a brave heart and endure one half of the terrors we dread than to calculate all of the terrors and suffer nothing at all. Big things are won by big dangers. That settles it. Xerxes sends Arrhabazus back to rule the existing empire, while turning his own attention to doubling its extent. He prays to the sun for the strength to conquer not just Greece, but all of Europe. He has myrtle branches strewn before the bridges. He orders his priests to burn incense, and he rewards the Hellespont by pouring into it a libation, followed by the golden cup that contains it, followed by the golden bowl in which it was mixed, followed by, as well by a sword. This clears the way for the crossing, which takes 7 days and nights to complete. As Xerxes himself reaches the European shore, an awed bystander is heard asking why Zeus had disguised himself as the Persian monarch, bringing along all the people of the world. Could the god not have destroyed Greece on his own? 1. 2,419 years later, an Oxford Don took a break from a tutorial to go to a party. 30 at the time, Isaiah Berlin had been born in Riga, brought up in St. Petersburg, and after witnessing the Bolshevik Revolution at the age of 8, immigrated with his family to England. There he thrived, mastering the new language through a thicket of accents that never left him, triumphing in his Oxford examinations and becoming the first Jew ever elected to an All Souls College fellowship. By 1939, he was teaching philosophy at a new college, established in 1379, developing a aversion to logical positivism. Nothing means anything without reproducible verification, and hugely enjoying life. A glittering conversationalist with a sponge-like thirst for ideas, Berlin relished opportunities to show himself off and to soak things up. At this party, the exact date isn't known, he ran into Julian Edward George Asquith, the second Earl of Oxford, and Asquith, then finishing a classic degree at Balliol. Lord Oxford had come across an intriguing line from the ancient Greek poet Archilochus of Paros. It was as Berlin remembered it. The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. The passage survives only as a fragment, so its context has long been lost. But the Renaissance scholar Erasmus played around with it. The Berlin couldn't help doing the same thing. Might it become a scheme for classifying great writers? If so, Plato, Dante, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, and Proust would all have been hedgehogs. Aristotle, Shakespeare, Goethe, Pushkin, and Joyce were obviously foxes. So was Berlin, who distrusted most big things, like logical positivism, but felt fully at ease with smaller ones. Diverted by World War II, Berlin didn't return to his quadruples until 1951, when he used them to frame an essay he was preparing on Tolstoy's philosophy of history. It appeared 2 years later as a short book, The Hedgehog and the Fox. Hedgehogs, Berlin explained, relate everything to a single central vision, through which all that they say and do has significance. Foxes, in contrast, pursue many ends, often unrelated and even contradictory, connected, if at all, only in some de facto way. The distinction was simple but not frivolous. It offered a point of view from which to look and compare, a starting point for genuine investigation. End quote. It might even reflect, quote, one of the deepest differences which divide writers and thinkers, and it may be human beings in general, end quote. Having fired off that flyer, however, Berlin failed to illuminate much with it beyond Tolstoy. The great man had wanted to be a hedgehog, Berlin claimed. War and Peace was supposed to reveal the laws by which history worked. But Tolstoy was too honest to neglect the peculiarities of a personality and the contingencies of a circumstance that defy such generalizations. So he filled his masterpiece with some of the most fox-like writing in all literature, mesmerizing his readers who happily skipped the hedgehog-like history ruminations scattered throughout the text. Torn by contradictions, Tolstoy's approach to death, Berlin concluded, a desperate old man, beyond human aid, wandering self-blinded at Clonus, as like Oedipus. Biographically, this was too simple. Tolstoy did die in an obscure Russian railway station in 1910 and at the age of 82, after abandoning his home and family. It's unlikely that he did so, though, regretting loose ends left decades earlier in War and Peace. Nor is it clear that Berlin evoked Oedipus for any deeper purpose than to end his essay with a dramatic flourish. Perhaps too dramatic, for it suggested irreconcilable differences between foxes and hedgehogs. You had to be one or the other. Berlin seemed to be saying, you couldn't be both and be happy, or effective, or even whole. Berlin was therefore surprised, but pockishly pleased, when his creatures went viral. Long before there was internet to help them along, references began proliferating in print. Cartoons appeared, requiring no explanation, and in university classrooms, professors began asking their students, was X a fox or a hedgehog? Students began asking their professor, is it better to be a hedgehog or a fox? both began asking themselves, where within this polarity should I seek to be? And then, can I stay there? And finally, who in the end am I? By way of Oxford party, archaeological fragment, and a choice epic, Berlin had stumbled upon two of the very best ways to become intellectually indelible. The first is to be Delphic, a trick known to oracles throughout time. The second is to be Aesopine. Turn your ideas into animals, and they will achieve immortality. 2. Herodotus, who lived from the 480s to the 420s BCE, may have known Archaeologus circa 680 and 645 on foxes and hedgehogs. He cites the poet in another context, and so could have been the poem, if still extant, in which they first appeared. Even if he didn't, it's hard to read Herodotus' account of Artabanus and Xerxes at the Hellespont without sensing in the advisor an uneasy fox, and in the monarch an unapologetic hedgehog. Artabanus stretches price to be paid, in energy expended, in supplies stretched, in communications compromised, in morale weakened, in everything else that can go wrong when seeking to move any larger forces across any body for land and water. Success requires taking on too much. Does Xerxes not think that the god strikes with lightning only those who attempt big things, while the little ones do not itch the god to action? Dismantle the bridges, disband the armies, and send everybody back home. Artabanus urges, where the worst that can await them will be more bad dreams. Xerxes, who weeps for the dead 100 years hence, has a larger and longer views. If death is the price of life, why not pay the lesser prices that make life memorable? Why be a forgettable king of kings? Having tamed the Hellespont, he can hardly stop. The bridges had to lead somewhere. Great militaries carry all they need to ensure that what can go wrong won't, or that if it does, it won't matter. It is the God that leads us on, and so, when we of ourselves set about our many enterprises, we prosper. End quote. Artabanus respects environments, knowing that landscapes can help or hinder an army, that fleets never fully control the seas on which they sail, that the weather is beyond any mortal's capacity to predict. Commanders must distinguish where they can act from what they must accept, trusting only in such craft as the circumstances allow. Xerxes, in contrast, reshapes environments. He turns water into more or less solid ground by bridging the Hellespont. He makes solid ground liquid by putting a canal across the Athos Peninsula, one of mere arrogance. Herodotus tells us, so his ships won't have to sail around it. The king doesn't worry about what he will have to accept, because he will flatten whatever gets in the way, and he trusts only the divine hand that has entrusted him with such power. The short-sighted Artabanus seems so much on the immediate horizon that complexity itself is the enemy. The far-sighted Xerxes sees only a distant horizon on which ambitions are opportunities. Simplicity is the searchlight that shows the way. Artabanus keeps changing his mind. His twists and turns are meant, like those of Odysseus, to get him home. Xerxes, in crossing the Hellespont, becomes Achilles. He will have no home other than in the tales the future will tell of the deeds he has done. The fox and the hedgehog, therefore, find no common ground. With his warnings unheeded, Artabanus heads east from Abydos and after Herodotus, who makes no further mention of him. Xerxes moves west, taking his armies, his navy, and his historian with him, as well as all subsequent chroniclers of the Persian invasion. The Hellespont, a boundary between continents, now also separates the two ways of thinking that Archilochus anticipated, that Berlin would make her famous, and that a late 20th century feat of social science would still more sharply define. 3. In an effort to determine the roots of accuracy and inaccuracy in forecasting, the American political psychologist Philip E. Hedgehog and his assistants collected 27,451 predictions on world politics between 1988 and 2003 from 284 experts in universities, governments, think tanks, foundations, international institutions, and the media. Replete with tables, graphs, and equations. Hedgehog's 2005 book, Expert Political Judgment, reports the findings of this most rigorous study ever done on why some people get the future right and others don't. Quote, who experts were, professional background, status, and so on, made scarcely an iota of difference, end quote. Hedgehog concludes, quote, nor did what experts thought, whether they were liberals or conservatives, realists or institutionalists, optimists or pessimists, end quote. But, quote, how experts thought, their style of reasoning did matter. The critical variable turned out to be self-identification as foxes or hedgehogs, when shown Berlin's definition of those terms. The results were unequivocal. Foxes were far more proficient predictors than hedgehogs, whose record approximated that of dart throwing and presumably computer-simulated chimpanzee. Startled by this outcome, Hedgehog sought what distinguished his foxes from his hedgehogs. The foxes relied, for their predictions, on an intuitive stitching together of diverse sources of information, not on deductions derived from grand schemes. They doubted that the cloud-like subject of politics could ever be the subject of a clock-like science. The best of them shared a self-deprecating style of thinking that elevated no thought about criticism, end quote. But they tend to be too discursive, too inclined to qualify their claims, to hold an audience. Talk shows hosts rarely invited them back. Policymakers found themselves too busy to listen. Hedgehog's hedgehogs, in contrast, shunned self-deprecation and brushed aside criticism. Aggressively deploying big explanations, they displayed a bristly impatience with those who do not get it. When the intellectual holes they dug got too deep, they would simply dig deeper. They become prisoners of their preconceptions, trapped in cycles of self-congratulation. These played well as sound beds, but bore little relationship to what subsequently occurred. All of which suggested to Hedgehog a theory of a good judgment, that self-critical thinkers are better at figuring out the contradiction dynamics of evolving situations, more circumspect about their forecasting prowess, more accurate in recalling mistakes, less prone to rationalize those mistakes, more likely to update their beliefs in a timely fashion, and as a cumulative result of these advantages, better positions to affix realistic probabilities in the next round of events. In short, foxes do it better. 4. The test of a good theory lies in its ability to explain the past, for only if it does can we trust what it may tell us about the future. Hedgehog's past, however, was the decade and a half in which he ran his experiment. Herodotus offers an opportunity to apply Hedgehog's findings, admittedly without his careful controls, to an age far removed from our own. They hold up across the distance surprisingly well. After crossing the Hellespont, Xerxes advanced, confident that the size of his forces and the opulence of his entourage would make a resistance futile. Quote, even if all the Greeks, and moreover all the men who live in the western countries, were assembled together, they would not be able to fight me. End quote. The king's plan seemed to be working as he proceeded through Thrace, Macedonia, and Thessaly, but his progress necessarily was very slow. His army was so large that it drank rivers and the lakes dry before all of its units could get to the other side. Lions, still flourishing in the region, developed a taste for the camels carrying his supplies, and Xerxes was exhausting the capacity of even cooperative Greeks to meet his culinary requirements. One gave thanks that the king ate only once a day, for if his city had been asked to provide breakfast on the scale of the dinner Xerxes demanded, its inhabitants must either have fled or been ground to dust, worse than any people on earth had ever been. Nor could Xerxes flatten all topography. The Persians, to enter Attica, would have to march through the narrow pass at Thermopylae, and it was there that Leonidas' Spartans, a far inferior force hastily recruited, delayed the invaders for several days. Neither Leonidas nor his elite 300 survived. But their refusal to surrender showed that Xerxes could no longer rely on intimidation alone to get what he wanted. Meanwhile, late summer storms in the Aegean were battering his fleet, while the Athenians followed the orders of their admiral general Themistocles, were evacuating their city. This left Xerxes with Napoleon's dilemma at Moscow in 1812. What do you do when you have captured your objective, only to find it abandoned and bad weather on the way? The King of Kings fell back, characteristically, upon still more intimidation. He burned the Acropolis and then mounted another throne atop another promontory overlooking another body of water from which to witness what remained of his navy complete his triumph. Surely smoke rising from their holiest temple would demoralize the Athenian city rowers. But the bay was Salami. The Triames were trained, and the Delphic oracle had promised safety behind wooden walls, presumably the kind that floated. So as Xerxes watched, the Greeks sent his fleet to the bottom and slaughtered the survivors, who in any event hadn't been taught how to swim. The king had no choice now but to accept, much too blatantly, his uncle's advice to return home. Themistocles hastened the king's departure by spreading the rumor that the Hellespont bridges would be the Athenians' next target. Terrified, Xerxes hastened to get back across, leaving his demoralized armies to fend for themselves. The Greeks then defeated them at Plataea, but left a further reputation imaginatively to a playwright. Archilochus the Persians, first performed 8 years after Salome, depicts the bedraggled Xerxes limping into his own capital to the lamentations of all who had earlier acclaimed him, and to this warning from the chastened ghost of Darius, quote, "Never, being mortal, ought we cast our thoughts too high." End quote. Herodotus, drawn on Aeschylus for his history, could he have also for his account of the dreams, evoking Darius' spirit if not his ghost, that draw Xerxes to the Hellespont in the first place? There is no way to know for sure. Spirits are shadowy things, but it is fun to imagine this particular shadow, whoever he represented, using his supernatural powers to zoom forward in time to absorb and then take back to the now disconsolate King of Kings. Professor Tetlock's warning about how often foxes are right and hedgehogs are trumps. 5. Xerxes' invasion of Greece was early but a spectacular example of a hedgehog-like behavior. Being king of kings was a very big thing. If Xerxes could gather the greatest military force ever while turning water into land at the Hellespont and the land into water on the Athos Peninsula, then what couldn't he do? Why not, after conquering Greece, all of Europe? Why not, he even asked himself at one point, a Persian empire that has the same limit as Zeus' sky? But Xerxes failed, as is the habit of hedgehogs, to establish a proper relationship between his ends and his means. Because ends exist only in the imagination, they can be infinite. A throne on the moon, perhaps with a great wheel, means though are stubbornly finite. They are boots on the ground, ships in the sea, and the bodies required to fill them. Ends and means have to connect if anything is to happen. They are never, however, interchangeable. The only constraints Xerxes imposed on capabilities were his own aspirations. He hoped for the best, assuming that it would be the worst. He lived only in the present, cutting himself off from the past, where experience resided, and from the future, where the unforeseen lurked. Had Xerxes grasped these distinctions, he would have seen that his armies and fleet could never be transported all that it would take just to invade Greece, unless the king could induce those he was invading to supply his invasion. Not easy, his own men, although probably not himself, would soon begin to get hungry, or thirsty, or tired. Resistance by a few, as a thermal play, would shake the confidence of many, and the winter would be coming on. There would have been risk too, though, in following the fox like Artabanus. He could have warned Xerxes of the depleted rivers, hungry lions, sudden squalls, resentful locals, fierce fighters, cryptic oracles, avid rowers, and sinking non-swimmers awaiting him across the Hellespont. Because their causes were knowable, their consequences were predictable, but only individually, for not even the keenest seer can specify cumulative effects. Little things add up in unpredictably big ways, and yet leaders can't let uncertainties paralyze them. They must appear to know what they are doing, even when they don't. Xerxes carried this principle to a ferocious extreme. When Peleus, the Lydian, provided all the troops and the treasure the king had requested for the invasion, save only the service of his eldest son, Xerxes found a way to show unforgettably his resolve. He had the young man bisected, and then ordered his armies to march between the bloody halves. That left no doubt as to Xerxes' determination. But this literal red line locked him in. He couldn't have rethought his plans now, even if he would have wanted to. He had wanted to. The tragedy of Xerxes and Artabanus is that each lacked the other's proficiency. The king, like a Ted locks hedgehogs, commanded the attention of audience, but tended to dig himself into holes. The advisor, like a Ted locks foxes, avoided the holes, but couldn't retain audience. Xerxes was right. If you try to anticipate everything, you will risk not accomplishing anything. But so was Artabanus. If you fail to prepare for all that might happen, you would ensure that some of it will. Okay, let me stop here and we'll read later the second part.